Um, all right, so we're gonna just dive in. And to begin, Dabney, will you lead us in a little exercise kind of to get the juices flowing? Tell
Yeah.
me if you need me to stop sharing.
Um, sure. Yeah. If you could stop sharing, that'd be great. So, just to get us going, why don't we have everybody type into the chat? You can type your name, your pronouns, and if you have any special reason that brought you to this session, we'd love to know that. So, just so that we can get to know you a little bit as we're getting going. And then the other thing we're going to do is we wanted to do a little warm up exercise, and this is completely anonymous. So, there's no rules, there's no right or wrong answers here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste into the chat a link, a hyperlink that's going to take you to these slides that you're seeing displayed. And actually, it won't let me do that while I'm sharing. So I'm going to paste it into the chat now. And you should see a Google link that's going to take you to this screen. So we wanted to ask this question as an opening question. Um, what are our strongest messages against early abortion ban legislation? So, probably most everybody knows that since 2011, but particularly in 2019 and 2020, there's been a wave of early abortion ban legislation across the South, but also in other states. And so, just thinking off the top of your head, what do you think are our strongest messages? Go ahead and type into the box. You're anonymous, so no one can see who's writing what, but we just want to do a little hive mind exercise here and think about what you think are the strongest messages. So I'm going to stop the share for the moment so people can just sort of think on that. All the slides are the same, so if you have a lot you want to say, you can feel free to click into slide 2 or 3 or 4, and you can answer that question based on your thoughts.
Yes, and while this while you all are putting your thoughts in here, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background on early abortion legislation, and then we'll go back to these slides. So, if you could, thank you. Oh no, I don't want to stop recording. so, so early abortion ban legislation um, is particularly pervasive in the South. This is for reasons that, that we all kind of intuitively know and understand. The culture legislatively in southern states has often been really, really hostile towards abortion, particularly in the number of laws and the speed at which they put laws through the legislature. When I'm talking about early abortion bans, I'm talking about those bills that come under the flag of personhood or heartbeat. They often use the term heartbeat legislation, and I'm trying not to use that term here because it is incredibly inaccurate and it is very stigmatizing. And but these heartbeat bans really strive to um, end the possibility of access to abortion at the detection of what they call possible cardiac activity. As we know from medical science, the cardiac system is not really developed at this point. These bans strive to end abortion at around 6 weeks gestation or even earlier than that. These bans have, even though it feels like these bans are a very new kind of strategy, they've actually started around 2011. It's just 2018 to 2019 where they proliferated in state legislatures. And this was a real concerted strategy on the part of anti choice proponents to push these personhood amendments through. What we have found at Emory Rollins, and why we were really interested in looking at this type of legislation, is because both Dabney and I are public health researchers. And from the public health standpoint, legislative debate really doesn't get studied. What people say in state legislatures, what they say in committee meetings, we don't use that as regularized data in public health, even though we look at the outcome impacts of a lot of this legislation on people on the ground. Let me see if I can. So, in our research, what we were striving to do was to really just simply describe the arguments and evidence espoused by supporters and opponents of the heartbeat bill. So people who are pro bill and con bill. But right now, we're just going to talk about the people who supported this bill or people who pushed these bills through the legislature. So this is our multi-state analysis, and we're really proud of it because we looked at legislative debate from 6 states in the southern U.S. And this means, and starting in 2018 and going through the 2019 legislative session, that one legislative session, and we gathered data from both committee meetings, which are the meetings prior to being a bill going into the House or the Senate debate. We looked at Senate and House debate. Oftentimes when legislative debate is discussed, people forget about the committee meetings, and these committee meetings are really the meat and potatoes of where arguments are created, driven, discussed, and they contain a lot of community-based testimony as well as legislative testimony. So that's why we sought to include them. A lot of this debate is publicly available. So we took the videos that were publicly available online as we could get them, and then we transcribed them verbatim into text and then analyzed them using Max QDA 18 software. So we used classic qualitative techniques in order to look at themes throughout this legislative debate. And it resulted in us looking at more than 300 pages of transcripts. And I would say that 300 is a conservative estimate. This is hundreds of hours of legislative testimony and debate. And then finally, we created what we call thick descriptions, which is a really broad ranging written analysis of what each of the themes were, both within the state. So for example, within Georgia or within South Carolina, and what themes were encountered across states. So what were common to all 6 of the states. Before we go into the results, I'm going to stop right there and see, let Dabney share with you what some of the messaging information that we've gotten so far.
And while I'm just transitioning, I see there's a question in the chat about which 6 states. So maybe you just rattle off the states really quickly.
Absolutely. Let's see if I can do this really fast. So we looked at Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee. Those 6. And the reason.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And we intentionally actually tried to look at every southern state, but there were some bills that actually never left, that were proposed but never went into committee, were never debated. Or in the case of Alabama, unfortunately, we couldn't include Alabama because there was absolutely no record of their committee, House, or Senate meetings online. And I'll discuss some of the implications of that when we talk about the end result. I know somebody in the chat talked about being really interested in North Carolina, and I'm from North Carolina, and so I was also interested in that. But it turns out that they didn't have a bill that passed within that session that we could look at the information.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And thanks for that question. It's a really good question. And as Suba was saying, there's lots of opportunity for where our movement can engage with this. So for example, Alabama is a perfect example where we all heard about this really extreme ban that had no exceptions. And they passed that in plain daylight, but at the same time, there's no record of the conversation that took place. And so this is a question of transparency and a part of our democratic process where we have to think about the opportunities for community engagement and participation. If you weren't able to show up at those hearings on the day, then you have no way of knowing what actually happened. And that's not a transparent process. Of course, we want to be able to stop things in real time or even get further upstream than that and have more positive reproductive health rights and justice legislation. But before we get there, we really need to make sure that these things see the light of day, that legislators are on the record with these things so that we can hold them accountable to them. So that's something just to plant a seed about. I wanted us to go back to just the brainstorming that was going on here about what our strongest messages are against this early abortion ban legislation. So these are your ideas that you all have come up with in just a short, 5 or so minutes, but want to echo them back to you here, because what we're going to shift to right after this is what the arguments that are being made by the anti-abortion side. So it's important for us to think about the arguments we're making and how those come up against or don't with the arguments that the anti-abortion advocates are making. So some of the things that you all generated were that women should have the right to decide, that abortion prior to viability has been deemed unconstitutional by SCOTUS, by the Supreme Court. People don't know they're pregnant yet, that again, it violates pregnant people's rights. They're not medically or scientifically valid, discriminate against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, may discourage pregnant people from seeking prenatal care. And I would probably extend that to say, post-abortion care for anyone that has miscarriage. Um, we've definitely seen that in other countries. And sexual violence, for example, in the case of rape and incest, may not be reported in times for exceptions. And then just limit options available to pregnant people, the basic principles of reproductive justice about being able to decide when and how to have a family and being able to raise children. So these are great ideas. So I just want to give a warning here that we're going to go back to the slides that Suba was sharing. And again, as she mentioned, we're going to be talking about the arguments that are made by anti-abortion legislators and activists. So some of what I'm going to say here is probably going to make you angry. I'm just the messenger, so don't be upset with me. But what we want to try to do here is really use this as an opportunity, a sort of reverse engineering to get at the strategy that's underneath what's happening here. We know that these laws are based on model legislation. And we know that these folks know that these laws, if they do pass, will be challenged in court. So, really, what we're trying to do is get at the argumentation that they're using, number one, to pass the legislation, and number two, potentially the argumentation that they might be using when they go to court with some of these. And I know that Monica will speak a little bit later on about the current Sister Song v. Kemp case that's here in Georgia. So we'll move into results here, and we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to talk about the what and the how. If you could go to the next slide, Suba. Thanks. So we're going to talk about what they did, and we're also going to talk about how they did it. So thinking about the arguments and the tactics that were used in advancing this legislation in the states where these bills did pass out of committee, and in some cases where they were signed into law. And then Suba mentioned the states that we're looking at here. So the first thing that they did was misrepresent medical science. And that was something that was echoed in the comments that you all just came up with. As you all know, these bills are sometimes called heartbeat bills, when in fact, what is actually being detected around 6 weeks is some potential cardiac activity, and it's not a heartbeat. So this idea of sort of a fully formed heart at 6 weeks is really preposterous, but this is basically one of the arguments that's being used to advance this legislation, and particularly tying a heartbeat to a sign of life. And this kind of is tied into end of life arguments where a heartbeat and respiratory activity are some of the indicators, for example, when making determinations about ending life. The second thing that they did was to co-opt the legal successes of progressive movements. And this, I know in Georgia is probably, for folks that we are working with here, probably one of the most offensive tactics. So really taking the progresses of both civil rights movements and thinking about the ways in which certain cases really advanced civil rights, particularly for Black people in this country, but also for LGBTQ populations. So for example, here in Georgia, we had arguments about the Obergefell case and the Massachusetts case, which made same-sex marriage legal at the state and then the federal level, and really taking those arguments and twisting them. So saying how, for example, the 3/5 compromise was not viewing previously enslaved peoples as whole people, and they're now taking that exact argument and twisting it and saying that now we are not viewing, we being states, are not viewing fetuses in utero as whole people. Similarly, so making a lot of parallel arguments with slavery and discrimination against LGBTQ people. So really offensive arguments, but they're hijacking our anti-discrimination arguments. And then the third thing was downplaying the harms of the bill. And not just the harms, because the harms are horrible enough. You know, in Georgia, we have the worst maternal mortality rate in the country. And so you all raised this question of prenatal access, but also the economics, which is something that may be a point that we can leverage in our argumentation, because there were a lot of weaknesses and a lot of flaws in these bills, but those things were really sort of skimmed over. Next slide. So just a couple of examples here. And again, these are pretty disturbing statements. So just want to give everybody a little bit of a warning that these things are pretty hard to read sometimes. So an example of a male legislator for South Carolina on this theme of misrepresenting medical science. So he said, another fact-based saying is if the absence of a heartbeat indicates death, then logically the presence of a heartbeat indicates life. So this is exactly the argument I was just talking about, trying to tie end of life questions to beginning of life questions. And he says the human heartbeat is the objective scientific proof of life. And that's really a misrepresentation, because even if you look at the end of life laws, which there are some laws that called the Determination of Death Act, there are several factors that have to be present. And that is, for example, the absence of both a heartbeat and respiratory activity, where in a 6-week-old embryo, and it's really the embryonic stage, not the fetal stage, there is no respiration at that stage. So they're trying to connect the dots when the dots aren't really there. Next slide. The second theme, as I mentioned, was co-opting progressive successes. And we saw this in Georgia as well as in other states. So here's a quote from a Georgia legislator, another male legislator. The 14th Amendment passed in 1868 to give full legal recognition to entire classes of persons that had never been given full legal recognition. That's exactly what we're doing here. So trying to hijack legislation, or in this case, a constitutional amendment, to recognize the full legal recognition. And so the argument being made here is a personhood argument, and saying from the point of a beating heart, that is the identification that they're using as life, that is a whole human being in the womb. Next slide. And then the third theme of downplaying harms, and this again is a quote from a male legislator in Tennessee. There could be as many as 16 states that would have laws on the books that would protect unborn children upon the overruling of Roe v. Wade. Collectively, these laws would save hundreds of thousands of unborn children from the violence of abortion. So there's a couple of things here. The first thing is framing abortion as violence. And I think that's a really important argument for us to unpack, because again, it's a type of co-opting. And so we talk about the violence and the harms of not having access to prenatal care, not having access, or having bad maternal mortality statistics, not having women have their autonomy in terms of making choices about their reproductive lives. And they're trying to use a violence argument against us. So that's something we really need to look out for. Next slide. And then there's this sort of women's health argument, which we've heard many times, but this idea of saving, in this case, children, or saving women's health. So I'll shift now to the how they did it. And this is really, there's, if I had to sum this whole presentation up in one word, it would probably be appropriation. I mentioned this already in that second theme in terms of appropriating progressive victories, but there's a sort of stepwise process that they're using here. The first thing is establishing the heartbeat as an indication of life. So that's a critical piece here. And that's exactly why they're calling these bills heartbeat bills. And once they've established that the heartbeat is a sign of life, they're connecting life to this idea of a class of persons who are the unborn, right? And they're trying to make an argument that this class of persons is being discriminated against. And they're using previous progressive victories as examples of prior discrimination against Black people, against LGBTQ people, and invoking progressive values about anti-discrimination and concepts of equality in opposition to, for example, slavery, civil rights, and same sex marriage. And they're evoking these things to make this argument about this class of persons that they've identified who are what they would call children in the womb or the unborn. And there's a lot of coercion narratives about pregnancy and pregnancy coercion. So particularly, we hear the narratives, and this is more from the community activists who will say things like, my mother was told that I would never survive, and here I am. Or women telling their abortion stories and talking about the regret or the negative effects that they themselves experience from that, even though those things are counter to what we know from much of the scientific evidence about women's experiences of abortion or people's experiences of abortion and how they feel about it afterwards for the most part. Next slide. So just a few more quotes here. This one from a male legislator, and maybe you're noticing a theme about male legislators here. A male legislator from Kentucky, that the heartbeat equals life. I want everyone to look at your fingers right now. You take those two fingers right now and you place them on your wrist. What do you feel? A heartbeat. It's undeniable. When there's a heartbeat, there's life. And that life is unique inside of its mother's womb because our fingerprints alone show that each and every one of us have our own unique identity. So using these kinds of examples, which is really a simplification, right? Going down to this simple idea of a heartbeat as something that a lot of people can relate to, and using things like everyone's seen an episode of ER where there's a heart monitor, and when the flat line goes, you know that there's no life there. So this is the kind of argument that they're making. And similarly, this quote also uses this idea of fingerprints, and that was something that we saw in other states as well, this idea of a unique human being being identifiable because of fingerprints. Next slide. And then false equivalencies. So this is a quote from a female community member in Louisiana, my home state. So the abortion industry is comparable to slavery. This baby is property of the mother. The baby has no rights. Just like slavery, it was property. Well, for abortion here in Louisiana, you can get for $500 or $2,500 the heart of the baby taken, no dignity. I taught high school biology, and it's not hard for even a kindergartner to see that the heartbeat is life. So again, tying together two themes here. Number one, how simple it is to understand that the heartbeat is equivalent to life. The second argument here is this equivalency between slavery and abortion. So again, trying to make the comparison that unborn fetuses are a class of persons and that they're being discriminated against because of abortion or by abortion. And then this third claim that has to do with the in quotes, abortion industry. So we've given you a lot to chew on there. And what we want to do is turn it over to Monica, who is going to share a little bit about sister song strategy, and then guide us in a conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dabney and Suba. That was incredible. We're so grateful for the work that you all are doing over there and like helping to just make this so clear for folks, because I think that one of the things that is so hard for us as reproductive justice activists, organizers, organizations on the ground is to give people the full picture of what it is that we are dealing with when it comes to these bills, when it comes to like our opposition pushing so hard and co-opting our strategies. Because what is real for folks on the ground is that they're in the midst of living this, right? They're trying to access what they need. They're trying to take care of their families. They're trying to live their lives. And so we become the bridge as activists and organizations to help people understand this. And so this type of data that is some of the best that I've seen that makes it so clear, it has been super helpful to the organizing efforts of those of us doing the work. So again, mad love to what you all are doing over there. And just to give you all a little context as to what's been going on with Sister Song. So like my comrade said, you know, these bills hit hard in 2019 with the actual abortion bans taking over the dominant narrative of the country, right? And so for, you know, usually when we hear abortion cases or whatever going to the Supreme Court, you know, we get like a small little spotlight. They'll talk about it for a little bit and it's gone. But we saw in 2019 that this really became like a serious talking point in the national news media, because the South was being taken over by these abortion bans. And Georgia, unfortunately, was one of the states that got hit with that. And so, as we were preparing to think about what our response was going to be to the House bill that was moving through our state legislature, and then the subsequent now court case that we have, there were a lot of things that went into play, right? As we were trying to fight this thing back in the state legislature, Georgia created a broad, beautiful, amazing collaboration across reproductive health, rights, and justice organizations across this state to really be a united front at that state capitol. And I think that's important to note, that even though us across the repro sectors have very different strategies, and we all kind of move autonomously in the ways that really work best for our base and for our communities. This was one of those moments where everybody really did have to be connected together, and we could not have done this separately. Like, right, this really did take a united front for us to be on top of what was happening at the state legislature. And we saw this modeled across all the other southern states, some more effectively than others, but we knew that that collaborative work was so necessary to beat this thing back, because those narratives were hard. I mean, they were, again, the co-optation, the like really like pulling at people's heartstrings with their stories that were just so, and I sat in many of those conversations, many of those hearings, and the way that the opposition just flooded that room with folks just completely twisting stories was alarming to me, because what and I've been doing organizing for a long time, so I know how the opposition works, y'all, and I know that you all do too. But what became even more scary for me in that moment was, oh, this is real. Like, and they have been working for now over a decade of resourcing this, of getting their people in formation to move hard and fast. And so while we have been in the defensive posture over this past decade of just making sure we keep ourselves above water and that we push back as much as we can, it was obvious to me that they have been working to make sure that they can hold on to this offensive position and push even harder and faster, which is what led us to not getting the victory that we wanted at the state legislature and having to then take the next step. And so Sister Song, along with Feminist Women's Health Center, as well as Planned Parenthood Southeast, became a partnership and moved towards putting a court case together, of course, with the legal help of the ACLU of Georgia, who's our legal partner in this, to fight this bill. And, Sister Song took on the lead plaintiff position in this. And I think that's what's important to note about that, y'all, is that most of the times in these cases, like we've seen with Whole Women's Health, we've seen in so many other positions where, our repro family has had to take up a major, legal fight. It's been the service providers that have really taken center stage in those cases, which is important, right? Because the service providers absolutely are the most impacted by this work, because they are the ones providing the services for community. But we decided to take a different turn with this particular case in Georgia. And Sister Song was moved to the front position as an advocacy movement building organization, as well as a membership organization. And so there were a lot of things that came up around that, because it's easier to prove standing, as it's called in legal jargon, as a service provider, because you're like, my patients need X, Y, and Z. We had to prove that our membership was directly impacted by this crazy abortion ban that was looming over our heads. And so we actually had to work harder to do that. But we were able to prove that and to really make this case stand on the merit of our membership, which is a game changer in terms of like, when I'm thinking into the future, and we'll talk about that in a second. It was a huge game changer because it gives advocacy-based organizations and states the ability to actually start to move in these in a legal way, in ways that we had not done in the past, right? So we took that on, we fought long and hard, and we got this victory, right? We were able to make sure that this abortion ban did not come to play in Georgia. And so, yay, we celebrated that victory. And we were able to talk about it at our national conference last year. We were able to, Time magazine was like, yo, reproductive justice in the South. We were all excited about like all the amazing accolades that we were getting along with our partners in this. And the unfortunate thing about the way that white supremacy, patriarchy, all these systems of oppression is set up, we can't sit in the victory too long, right? Because our opposition is constantly working to make sure that they suck every bit of joy out of our out of our work. It's so sad, right? But it's also just so real, and we have to be real in these moments. And so we know that our governor, who's feeling a bit some kind of way right now because, you know, Georgia's blue and has been moving towards blue for quite some time, that he's already said that he's going to appeal, right? And so we're still in this legal battle, right, to make this thing not our reality and for us to continue to hold on to this win. But I think that it's important to note that the way that these that the abortion work goes in connection to like all of the other larger, you know, political issues that are going on in this country, they're deeply connected to each other. When we think about but how we're set up at the federal level right now, we know what the Supreme Court looks like. We know the confirmation of the Amy person that we just got. And just to give kind of like a tangent of a moment, there was a case that just went before the Supreme Court called Fulton versus the city of Philadelphia. And now this case was about adoption, right? It was an adoption agency in the city of Philadelphia, a Catholic adoption agency that did not want to extend services to LGBTQ folks, right? And so now this case has gone before the Supreme Court. And one of the comments made by the newly appointed Amy Coney Barrett was, oh, well, if we make this exception to like say that this Catholic agency shouldn't do that, are we opening the door for hospitals to be able to force doctors to give abortions? She literally made that leap. So I'm telling you, like our opposition, they are ready to jump towards abortion and to chipping away and dismantling Roe in every possible fashion. And so to hear abortion come up in an adoption case, these are things we have to start paying attention to. When we break that down to Georgia and we see that now Georgia is blue and how this current administration is trying to continue to push back against that, we have a governor who, in my opinion, stole the election and is still trying to hold on to dear power. This could be an opportunity for him, and I know that he's probably seeing it that way, and we're already preparing for him seeing it this way. Is this case one of those ways that he can hold on to some of that power and try to regain some of, you know, his you know, whatever it is that he's trying to do to stay in power, right? Things that we have to pay attention to, this broader landscape. And I think that, you know, as we have been in the uprisings this year, as COVID-19 has ravished, you know, our country, like all of these things are connected to the work that we are doing to continue to fight for abortion access in this country. And so we can't see these as separate issues. And we have really had to look to the courts, which we know, and I'll tell you all, just as a very transparent moment, when we were asked to be a part of this case, as a Black woman-led organization that is focused on Black, Indigenous, people of color in this country, when we were approached by our legal partners to say, will you take up this case? We had to sit back on that for a second because we know that this system was not set up for us to actually win, right? And so we're having to lean on a system that was never designed for us and actually use that for us. And it's a bit of a mind trip, y'all. But what we were committed to as an organization was that, number one, we were committed to the people. And what our people said very clearly was that they did not want this abortion ban. We do not need this. It's not something we've asked for. And so we were committed to making sure that we used every possible avenue to push that thing away and to get that out of, you know, the possible future of Georgia. And one of the arguments that we raised, because this is one of the things I love how Dabney and the team really brought together like these different quotes and things that people said so we can see really clearly how folks are using these arguments, especially like attributing things to slavery and like all of that. What we said in our argument consistently was that we don't want to live in a state where we don't have the ability to make our own decisions about our bodies. That is actually taking us back to a day of slavery, right? And so we were able to like really push back on that particular argument. And as a Black woman being able to say that as the lead plaintiff in this case, it actually held a lot more weight. And so that's one of the other things I think that was really important for a sister song in particular, and a Black woman led organization like Sister Song, like Feminist as well with Kwajalein Jackson, for us to be a voice in this, is because what is real about the scope of repro in this country, when we think about who the messengers are around abortion access, who are the messengers around repro in general in this country, unfortunately, the visual that comes to mind for most people is a white woman, a white feminist, right? And so this really was a culture shift for Georgia, right? To have Black women's voices leading this conversation. And I think that was an important and incredible opportunity for us. And I think that we have to continue to push that narrative even wider and larger, across this national conversation that's coming up. So that's where we are. We're preparing now to get ourselves geared up for an appeal. We are preparing ourselves to continue to have to craft, really solid messaging that makes it super clear to our communities what's at stake. We are doing the work to make sure that the voices of those folks that we are doing this work with and for, that they are prioritized in this, that what their ask, their needs is actually what's driving this process. And so we're really digging deep in our own grassroots organizing and making sure that the voices of the folks are there and that people feel like they are equipped, right, with the knowledge and the wherewithal to be able to organize for themselves as well. And we're working across our different sectors with our birth justice folks, with our folks who are doing work with the movement for Black Lives and all of that, because there are connections to all of the different pieces of work. The argument around maternal health in this conversation is important. And so working with organizations like Black Mamas Matter and birth justice, doulas, midwives, and all of that to make sure that our messages are joined together is important. This conversation that they're trying to bring in around slavery and like all of this, our folks who are working doing that Black liberation work, we have to be in lockstep there, because not only, and this is one last thing I'll say because I want to open this up to conversations for you all, but one of the other challenges that wasn't necessarily put out into this data, because this was specifically looking at the legislatures, one of the other challenges that we came up against in terms of like this oppositional force around these issues is actually the challenge that we have within communities of color as well, and like this deep religious doctrine, right, that is just the fuel for so many of our communities, in particular Black communities, that has really also created an opportunity for our opposition to drive a wedge between our communities. And so not only are we fighting the white supremacy side of this, right? We're also fighting, our people that look just like us, right? Who are, trying to hold so hard and so fast to their religious beliefs that they're actually creating barriers as well. And so the work is so hard, right? But so necessary. And that's really how we're trying to, we're rooting ourselves in that and staying connected to the principles of RJ for us, which is very clear, and that's our driving force. But all of that is allowing us to keep moving forward in this moment. So I want to pause there before I start to talk even more about future kind of facing things, to see if there are any questions that are coming up from folks, any comments, any reactions to what you all have heard from the actual data that was presented, or just even from the context that I was able to give as an organization working on the front lines of this every day. So we're going to check this chat. I know that Suba's going to check the chat and questions for us to see if we can bring those into the conversation.
Yeah, keep asking your questions. We don't have any specific questions yet that I see, but Monica, thank you so much for the rundown on what's going on, and we incredibly appreciate it. And one thing I would say to dovetail off of what you were talking about is what's so powerful about the case is the centering of Black and Brown people and the community. And what is missing in testimonies in state legislatures are these people who are willing to put their in an ethical way, obviously, be able to come to the front line and talk about how abortion help them throughout their lives. What we've seen and what was evidenced for us in the legislative debate was that there is a focus, an overwhelming focus on abortion as healthcare, which is a really important point,
Yeah.
but it can't be the only point, you know? And
Mhm.
so, along with our great health providers, we need other voices, particularly voices that can speak to history, particularly voices that can speak to disability justice, that could speak to the fiscal implications. And to just clap back at some of the insane statistics that are arguably like very clearly fake, you know, when these testimonies are going on. But I think one thing that really shocked us was how um in tune with the current like moment anti-abortion proponents were. They're no longer making these kind of religiously focused arguments.
Right.
They're making arguments that are using the same evidence base that we would pull from, for example, the Guttmacher Institute or ACOG, and saying something completely inappropriate about those pieces of evidence. And so it's no longer like, and also they're taking the same social justice ethos that we have pushed for and worked for so long, and completely turning it on its head. So
Mhm.
let me check the chat. So
And I'll just, while Suba's checking the chat, I'll just echo what she's saying in terms of, and also what Monica said, which I think is so important, the cross movement work. So to what Suba is talking about, expanding our tent, who's under our tent, not
Right.
just OBGYNs, but also economists that can talk about, okay, Georgia, that has an expanded Medicaid, what is it going to cost you if you really need to pay for, um, you know, child support for this child in the womb. And how do we actually quantify those things in terms of, thinking about bringing in pediatricians who can say it's not a child in the womb. Childhood is defined as birth until, right? And like just debunking. The other thing we talked about in our work is thinking about, in addition to transparency, the ways in which science has been co-opted. And this, even though we have a new administration, and thanks to Blue Georgia, we will have a new administration coming into office. This era of disinformation and misinformation, the seeds for that have been planted deep, and that is not going away with the current occupant of the White House. So we really need to do some work in our movement to ensure not just to reify doctors, because I think we all agree that we need to expand the tent and have more people in our movement, but to really get back to what is science and what does science say and mean if that's going to be part of our argumentation.
Um,
Mhm.
so we have three really great questions in the chat that I'll read out to y'all. So first, China asked, how can we ensure solidarity while centering the work within the community that extends beyond just support? I think that's probably directed specifically at you, Monica. And Susan asked, do you see or expect a shift in strategy from the right in response to cases brought from BIPOC-led orgs as opposed to clinics and providers as plaintiffs? Also a really great question. And then Nisha asked, I have seen some research coming out that suggests it can be helpful in our messaging to recognize that abortion is complicated because many people feel it ends potential life while also allowing people to make important decisions and control their own lives. And how that type of messaging and recognition of a complexity and nuance can help break through some of the polarization around abortion. Is this something that you have found in either of your research or advocacy work on the ground? And I think I can speak to that one for sure. Maybe we can start with the solidarity question. Monica, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. But the last question was really resonating with me for a
Yeah.
moment. Do you mind if I just
Yeah, absolutely.
on that?
Feel free.
I mean, I want to speak to all of them at some point, but that one just kind of hit home just because I've been in deep conversation with my mother over the past couple of weeks. And so what's coming up for me, I do think that from an advocacy effort, yes, we've always tried to talk about abortion as like I'm not an evangelical. I'm not telling you that you need to be at the march with us with the sign saying that may not be where you are. And I'm gonna put this like in a storytelling perspective, like with me and my mom, right? When my mother is a Southern rural North Carolina woman, loves her church, all about it, right? And she has this lesbian, very outspoken, you know, daughter that's talking about sexual and reproductive health and all the things, right? And we've had some really good conversations lately about me not making her feel like she has to be pro abortion, but understanding that people should be able to make their own decisions about what they need for themselves. And that means that she shouldn't put up her own barriers because of her own personal opinions about it, right? That she should not then become a barrier for other people. And I saw the same thing happen with us whenever I came out to my family, right? Like my family went down for this for gay shit. They was like, "What?" They had no idea to even how to even talk to me. And so we had to journey over the years of just like who I am isn't a reflection of you. I am my own individual person. And so can you love me in my individuality for who I am? You know, and we did that work. And so I think that there's an opportunity to draw those types of stories out, because that is what, as much as I love science and I love research and I'm down for that, we got to do it. What has pushed our opposition so far ahead of us is that they lean heavily on stories.
Right.
They will run them far and wide, right? And
Right.
so we don't do enough of that. And so I think that, you know, the stories like me and my mom, and then there's so many other stories out there that really show people at those intersections. Those are the kinds of things that we have to start to make visible for people, so that they can see themselves reflected, right? Not just like typed about, but like seen, right? Yeah, so I just wanted to talk to that question
Yeah.
really quickly, because I think that's the missing link. And we just did some community-based participatory research at Sister Song with our Trust Black Women work, to uplift some of those types of stories. So we're excited that's going to be coming out too. That's going to kind of be in tandem with all the amazing other research that's been going on. But we really focused on uplifting those stories and putting the faces to those stories, because we believe that that's really going to help drive and move people to be able to be okay, to give them a place to sit that doesn't feel like they have to be on one side or the other. They can just be where they are, but not become the barrier.
And I would totally echo what Monica's saying. I think from our research, what we found out is what is really missing are these, in some ways, these complicated stories. Even though in Georgia, in the legislative debates, legislators, Black women legislators came up and did tell their stories that were quite complicated and centered around abortion. There weren't enough of them versus in the supporters for these bills tend to have the same regular trope of narratives. And what's, I think you're asking sort of a couple different questions in that one question. And so I think from my perspective, the data absolutely shows that introducing people to complexity allows them to see the wide range of need for abortion and why it may not be your personal business why someone else might need this procedure, right? That they may not be able to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. I think that that is incredibly important in terms of advocacy and in terms of the research stories that we're telling. In terms of the legislature, what happens there is that there is a somewhat of an acknowledgement that things are complicated, but then a quick movement into dumbing down or decomplexifying what is going on. So I would urge, especially people who want to speak in front of the legislature, we have to think about having all ranges of stories that we can bring up in a quick and very uncomplicated manner. Like it's really hard in 1 minute to express the deep complexity around somebody's decision making, but it is much easier to take 1 minute of 20 people and then show the complexity, right? So like that's what I would say to that. And that was a really great question.
Yeah.
Do you want me to remind you of the other ones?
First one around solidarity, really quick. So let me tell y'all, I've said this in so many different spaces. Our silos will not save us. They're not going to save us. So if we think that this is the time for us to like huddle into our little, it's not going to work. And so I think though, where we have to start, on one hand, when I think about our opposition, they don't do this. They just know that we all agree on this thing, let's go,
Yeah.
right? And they run far and wide with it. But I think that where we can interrupt, right, their kind of momentum is that when a collaboration or something is built off of just that, it is not sustainable. It's not, right? It can be swayed, it can move, and the only thing that saves them is that they just keep putting money, right? They just keep pouring resources into things, but they're not stable. I think that what we need to be building right now are very intentional, very stable collaborations and building off solidarity in that way, which requires us to actually slow down a little bit and really figure out what political unity means, right? How are we building trust, right, in a way that will allow us to move for the long haul, because our work is for the long term. We are not, we can't think about our work as like, let's just get past this bill and let's just get past this thing, because as we've seen now over this past decade, working on it in that particular way isn't getting us the wins that we want. So I think it's time for us to switch that dynamic. I think it's time for us to really sit in some uncomfortable conversations with each other, to really address all of the isms that show up, in our collaborations, and to do that work and to lean on those folks who are skilled and experts at transformative justice, healing justice practices, to help us really do solidarity, like to really be that, not just say that we're doing it, but to actually be that. And that actually takes work. It takes work to figure out who's not at the table, who hasn't been at the table, why they haven't been there, why we ain't allowed them to be there. These are big questions that we're going to have to start answering, and coming to grips with, if we want to really move as a united front and to really switch the position that we're in. So that's my answer to solidarity, is that I don't want us to say solidarity anymore. I want us to be that. And that requires us showing up to these spaces in conversation and building this thing out in a way that's rooted in those deep principles of transformative justice, that builds the trust, that gets us to the place that we want to go. Like that's really what I'm focused on these days. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Just to echo what you're saying, Monica, I totally agree with everything you're saying. And I think just one concrete example has to do with disability rights.
Yes.
So specifically focusing in on abortion, when we think about things from a rights perspective or from a justice perspective, we talk about disability rights over here and reproductive rights over here, disability justice over here, reproductive justice over here. And the truth is, it is messy and complicated. But we have to dig into these difficult questions, as you're saying, because the alternative is that the other side wins in that case, because they have already done that, right? They've already got people who said, my mother was told that I would never live, or that I would be disabled, or that I would this or that. And those people, not all of them, of course, not speaking universally, but they are beginning to have that narrative. They have that narrative in their tool chest. And so in some ways, our work is so much harder because it is so much more complex and nuanced, and they have a very straightforward set of arguments that they're making. So I totally agree with you. And that's just one big, messy conversation that we have to have.
It's a great example. Can you remind us of the second question, Suba? Because I cannot remember what that was now.
Absolutely. Do you see or expect a shift in strategy from the right in response to cases brought from BIPOC-led orgs, as opposed to clinics or providers as plaintiffs, which has been the traditional plaintiff?
Absolutely. Yeah. They're ready for that though, because they've been building against that though. They've been building a counter argument against that. So a few years ago, just to give you all an example of why this Trust Black Women work for us and doing this research was so important this year. 10 years ago, billboards came to Georgia that said the most dangerous place for an African-American child is in the mother's womb. And so this rhetoric of, Black women are committing genocide because they're, having abortions was our opposition pushed that forward, and they found Black people like the Alveda Kings and this Ryan Brownberger guy and all these folks to be their messengers for that. So they've already been mounting up um their arsenal of folks. I hate to use such, harsh militia like language, but they're already gearing up for that. The thing is, though, we've been working really well at creating a counter narrative to that, right? And we of course we have the Trust Black Women frame, which absolutely helps to debunk that. From a message standpoint. And we did the solidarity statement with the movement for Black Lives, Black Lives Matter, that said that, our movements are inextricably linked. So we've been doing our due diligence as well to try to fill some of those holes where they would actually try to drive those wedges. I think that where we're going to have to build up more of a defense is in the church community, the Black church community, because I feel like that is just an open source for them to do that work. But we have amazing organizers. Like, I'll lift up our own faith organizer at Sister Song, Reverend Kenyatta Chinwe, organizations like the Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice, Sister Reach out of Tennessee. These are great organizations that have a really strong faith component to their work. And so they're already doing their due diligence of like organizing and equipping, Black preachers and ethicists and all the folks who are doing the theologies and stuff, and deepening their understanding of reproductive justice so that we could actually cut some of that off. I also think we have an opportunity to think about how we fill the gap from a pop culture perspective as well, because I think that'll be another avenue that they'll try to get in on. And so we've been doing some work with some great culture shift orgs, and even some, main celebrities and folks who we've been able to like really pull in as influencers, to be on deck and ready to like move the counter narrative when necessary. So, but the short answer is yes, they're going to use every possible way, right, to like really tear this thing down. And yeah, we're trying to fill those gaps now so that we're not too far behind the mark when we have to get ready to respond.
I don't think y'all are behind the mark at all. I think the equal protection arguments that you kind of saw in this round of legislative debate were in some ways a response to the idea that there might be on the ground orgs led by Black women that are going to that have been protesting and that are against a lot of this Black genocide argument, basically. And what they have also said in the legislative debate, which I think is interesting for the lawyers on and you all probably know, is that in these debates they're saying, well, we don't care about viability anymore. It's not about viability because Roe already decided viability. We're talking about rights. We're talking about another kind of rights, like for vulnerable population, and we're talking about expansion of civil rights and civil protections at the state level beyond the federal level. And so these are really, Monica, you guys have been thinking about this. You understand this, and this is a pervasive argument, I think, that really gets into people's skin because people want to be on the side of justice, and so the idea that this is a just cause, fighting for this is a just cause, is actually creating more equality in the world, I think really speaks to a certain group of people. We know that it's very hollow and it isn't actually doesn't hold weight, but that they've been testing the argument using the Equal Protection Clause as already.
That's real. Absolutely. I appreciate that too. Yeah, there's so much to do, and there's so many ways that we can, messengers right now of this work is just so important. And I just think that piece of our work of like creating those solid messages, really uplifting the stories of the folks on the ground, that's really that's the vehicle for us right now. I think that's what's going to fuel so much, not only our own organizing, but just our ability to build the counter narrative necessary in this moment.
So I just want to point us back perhaps to the slides in our last few minutes. We're talking, and I think we've touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that we thought we might end with as a question, and if folks do have questions, please do type them into the chat. But we're thinking about what sways people, and particularly decision makers. So we started this conversation thinking about legislators, and we've talked about storytelling as a tactic. We've talked about sort of broadening our tent and bringing other actors in. We talked about faith communities and the ways in which anti-abortion activists and actors have driven wedges within our potential movements or our collaborators. One of the things that happened in the state of Georgia is that although our early abortion ban legislation, HB 41, did pass, it passed by a very narrow margin. And so what we thought we could do as like a wrap up activity here is to really think about what sways decision makers. And these Google Docs, we'll leave them up. So if any of these ideas are useful to you, for folks that are doing this work on the ground in your states, you're welcome to revisit this. Also, the recording of this session will be available. So if you want to see our slides, feel free to reach out to us if you've got questions about the data that we've got. But if we don't have any other questions, if folks want to just type into the chat what they think sways decision makers, or feel free to throw any more questions in.
I think that another thing that we found in the data that might be of interest to y'all is there has always been a longstanding juxtaposition between abortion and adoption, as if adoption is the exact equivalent, like counter to abortion. And there's very little discussion of how complicated adoption is, both emotionally and to actually carry out in general. And I think that's one of the areas that, when probed in the Georgia debate about foster care rates in the state of Georgia, and then also about the process of adoption, I think that really got to the heart of some of these legislators who actually make it their business to be on the side of children's rights, who actually are foster care advocates and who do really know the realities of what young children face when they're going through these systems. So I think that some of these really opening up the discussion to talking about the realities of some of these systems is really important. And in the chat, I'll put Dorothy Roberts, I believe, just recently wrote a book, or is going to write a book on this. And I don't know if anybody's read it yet, but I'll see if I can find the name of it. Monica, do you think that there's anything that you all have seen that have swayed specific legislators in conversation with them, one-on-one conversation, or do you just feel like this is like a tactic, and so people don't move?
I think what moves legislatures is when they see concentrated people power, right? When they see that there is clear messaging that's moving the masses, that's organized people, they start to move, right? And of course, and I'm talking about like in general, because we have like our legislative champions who are always on our side, who are always trying to work with us and creating that kind of stuff. So mad love to them always, right? But in terms of just like general principle of like what moves them, it's concentrated people power. And I look a lot to like what has been created with the movement for Black Lives in particular, right? With like the defund the police messaging and things like that. It has created a national narrative, like a national conversation that pushes everybody to have to pay attention to that, right? And that took concentrated people power, you know what I'm saying, to move that, and to not let up from that. And I think that I just want to give a bit of breath to us, you know, those of us doing repro work, whether directly every single day or connected to it in any kind of way. We've been fighting for over a, I mean, for 40 something years. I mean, we've been fighting forever, right? But we have received hit after hit after hit after hit in our state legislatures. We've gone to the Supreme Court now twice within like the past 4 years, you know, trying to make sure that abortion access isn't, you know, taken away in this country. Like, we've been hit with a lot, right? And so folks are exhausted. And on top of that, Black Lives Matter. On top of that, Black trans lives matter. On top of that, I mean, it's like and that's the thing about reproductive justice. It is so intersectional. So we're on the front lines of all of these fights all the time. And so, you know, moments like the uprising gives an opportunity for concentrated people power that helps to move legislation now, like the Breathe Act, that's moving, you know, because of the work of the Movement for Black Lives. And that's very much what we need to move our legislatures too, right? Is our concentrated people power. Like, we have, you know, the Each Woman Act, we have, like, you know, different pieces of legislation that we've already been pushing, but it's like, how do we get renewed energy around that? And what is it going to really take for us to renew our commitment to reproductive justice, to grow the commitment of reproductive justice that gives us that concentrated people power, for people to know that this isn't just like something that us feminists or womanists or, you know, people over here are fighting for, but this is a people issue, right? That everyone is connected to. And I think that we have some opportunities there as a movement, and movements across our sectors. And I think now is the time to do that. So yeah, I think that's what influences them and that's what moves them. And I think that that's what a lot of our legislatures, you know, who haven't really stepped on the side of being our champions, that's what they're actually waiting for too. And so, yeah, that's how I would answer that. I hope that makes sense, but yeah.
I think that's a great answer. And Ella put in the chat, discussion around the cost of litigating anti-abortion policies have been persuasive in Montana. They have at least resulted in people questioning whether they should abstain from voting for some of these bills. I would say in the South, this comes up time and time again, that the majority of these legislators have not, they're not putting money into their communities when they're out pushing these bills, you know? And I think that many of them come without fiscal notes, which means they don't have any concerted strategy of how much it would cost to actually implement this bill, because it's unreasonable, and most of these bills are unconstitutional, right? To litigate an unconstitutional bill through the courts also costs a significant amount of money to the taxpayer. So you're absolutely right. This is another kind of pain point that we can point to. I just put on the screen our contact information. Please contact us. If you have any other questions or want to know anything further, we're going to keep working on this work together. Any final thoughts? I think we're almost at time.
No, I'm just really grateful for everything that you all do, Dabney and Subna. With this research, it has been incredibly, you know, just what you all are doing. It's supporting the work on the ground so well. And so I think this is a great example of what it looks like when research and organizing and all of that comes together. And I think we have to model this for other places and other regions, because it's been really helpful for us. And so I just want to give y'all love for what you're doing, and yeah, for how you're supporting the work of organizations like Sister Song. So thank y'all. And it was great doing this session with y'all. This was super fun.
I mean, thank you for being on the front lines of all of this for us. Like, we wouldn't have even gotten, to be honest, Dabney and I are constant co-conspirators, and we wouldn't have even gotten the idea without watching all of y'all fight so hard in the legislature to try to get HB 481 thrown out. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. And thank all y'all for coming to the session and being a part of the conversation and staying connected. We really appreciate that too.
Thanks,
Bye, everybody.
Enjoy
Bye.
the event.
See y'all at lunch.
Bye.
I'm going to stop recording.